In this video, I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the field of descriptive epidemiology. This topic is covered in depth in Chapter 5 of the textbook Epidemiology 101, so please make sure to read that chapter as well as this content. So in general, there are typically unequal distributions of health and disease across populations. So for example, cancer is a disease that unequally affects different groups of people within a population. So for example, cancer tends to affect people who are older more frequently than people who are younger. It tends to affect people in rural areas very differently from people in more urban areas. But in general, to try to understand and answer the question why we have these unequal distributions of health and disease and why they exist, we have to think about a few questions. And this includes considering who was affected, where did the health event or the disease occur, and when did it occur? Essentially, we're thinking about the who, the where, and the when. Descriptive epidemiology is understanding these things. It classifies the occurrence of disease according to the following variables. So it classifies disease according to person, so thinking about who is affected, the where, the place in which the disease has occurred, and then the time, the when and over what period of time has this condition occurred. In descriptive epidemiology, we're thinking about studies that are primarily focused on characterizing the amount and the distribution of health and disease within a given population. They are describing the burden of disease within a population and trying to characterize that. So for an example of a descriptive epidemiologic study, this is table 5.2 from your textbook. So please go back to your text and refer to this table as we go through this video. But this provides an example of a descriptive epidemiological study. It's looking at U.S. infants born in 2012 who were exclusively breastfed. This table actually lists their characteristics and describes their characteristics. So you can see this column here has the characteristics. So we've got sex, race, ethnicity. We've also got age of the mother as well as income to poverty ratio. And then in the top, these are labeled here. It shows these columns, which are sample size. We've got the percent and the 95% confidence intervals. And then we've got that for this column here as well as this column here. This column here shows the percent that were exclusively breastfeeding through 3 months of age. And then this column here is those who exclusively breastfed through 6 months of age. And what we can see from this table is that about 43% of this sample were breastfed during their first 3 months of life. However, interestingly, this drops to about 22% through the age of 6 months. Some other things that we can see from this table is that non-Hispanic Black mothers tend to engage in breastfeeding less often than other racial and ethnic groups, and have there's lower frequencies of breastfeeding that occur among women who are younger, have lower levels of education and income, and who are unmarried. So from this table, we're basically describing this sample in terms of breastfeeding and looking at these different characteristics and seeing how they differ in terms of breastfeeding behaviors. However, this is just descriptive. We don't know why the differences exist from this data, but we can look at this descriptive study, and this allows us to generate hypotheses that we can then test in future studies to try and actually understand why there are differences across these different characteristics. Descriptive epidemiologic studies have a number of uses. They can help us permit evaluation of trends in health and disease. specifically in monitoring diseases and identifying emerging problems. They can help us make comparisons across population groups, geographic areas, and time periods. They also provide a basis for planning, provision, and evaluation of health services. If we know a disease is affecting a specific population, then we can develop tailored interventions for that population. It also allows us to identify problems to be studied by more analytic methods and study designs. So, for example, in descriptive epidemiologic studies, we talked about that breastfeeding example in the previous slide. We saw that breastfeeding in infants, basically it was much higher at 3 months and then kind of dropped off at 6 months, and we saw some differences across those different characteristics of the population. So this is kind of an issue that highlights that we need future studies, specifically analytic study designs, to examine these issues more. This is also really important, in terms of identifying problems in the area of cancer disparities. We see a lot of racial ethnic differences in cancer incidence and mortality rates for various cancers. From descriptive studies, we know that these differences exist, but this allows us to then generate hypotheses about what is causing these disparities in the cancer burden, and designing analytic studies to try and answer kind of the why we see these issues.